Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Nuix webinar on cyber threat hunting. Really glad that you could join us today. I am dialing in from Herndon, Virginia, where it's a bit of a rainy Tuesday morning, but I'm thankful that there is nobody rowing a boat through the street outside my window. I'm going to be walking us through the material today on cyber threat hunting, and my co-presenter is David Smith, our CISO, and I will just pause here and let David introduce himself, and then we'll jump in.
Good morning. My name is David Smith. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for Nuix, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to join my colleague Hoke in this webinar.
All right, thanks, Dave. So again, I'm Hoke, Regional Director at Nuix. I focus on our cybersecurity solutions, the newest products that we have at Nuix. I've been in the company for about 2 years and came here after spending about 10 years working in the U.S. intelligence community on a range of different things, but I spent a good bit of time on insider threat detection, investigation, and protection, as well as big data analytics. So our goals for today really with this webinar are, for those of you that are kind of new to threat hunting, just demystify it a bit, share some insights that we've gained from customers and others who are out there doing threat hunting today. And for those of you that are experienced with threat hunting, I want to actually get really practical and tactical and show you some techniques to actually search and destroy, as we might say, advanced persistent threats on your network. We'll go right down sort of into the weeds with Nuix Insight Adaptive Security, which is the second newest Nuix product, and show you how we would approach threat hunting with that solution using endpoint data. Sorry, I had a bit of trouble advancing my slides. So the agenda today, we'll start off just defining threat hunting. We'll talk through why you should do this. So this may be helpful if you're trying to build the case within your organization to actually set aside resources for threat hunting. And what are the business drivers of why somebody might undertake it. We'll look at building a program, at some of the things that are important to factor in as you put your program together. I'll put forward an approach, and I said an approach is not the approach to threat hunting. I don't think anybody probably would claim that they have the approach. What this is a framework to help organize a threat hunting effort within an organization, and then we'll go through the demo. So just to start with the definition, to take a step back for a second, obviously, this is an important component of a broader information security program of an effort to provide, as they say in the industry, defense in depth. And on the left-hand side of the slide here, you see what it boils down to. It's basically about finding the bad guys who have penetrated your network defenses. On the right-hand side, there's a couple of more thoughtful contributions, one from SANS. The idea, there's a couple of useful ideas in this one. I think the iterative approach is a great addition. And what that means is threat hunting is hypothesis driven. We start with informed guesses about what assets an attacker might target, the vulnerabilities in the enterprise that he might try to exploit, and the tools or techniques that he might use to do that. And then we kind of work through in an iterative way, testing those hypotheses and refining them as we look for potential threats on our network. I think another useful idea in the SANS definition is that threat hunting is more focused on getting a deep understanding of the adversary targeting the network. In other words, it's not just about finding malware, updating AV defenses, it's about understanding the attacker's objectives and his methods at a deeper level, so that you can anticipate the next attack and prevent that. which brings up the key point that threat hunting really is about driving prevention ultimately. It's about reducing the number of successful attacks. I think one thing missing from this definition is the idea of proactivity, in my opinion. If you have a threat hunting program, you're basically saying as an organization that part of someone's job is to go out and look for threats, not in response to a specific incident, but out of a recognition that defenses are almost never airtight. Another good perspective that I found is from a guy named Samuel Alonso. He's a cybersecurity analyst at KPMG, and he's blogged on this and put some really great blog posts together. He brings in two sort of categories of threat hunting, one for known indicators and one for anomalies. And we'll talk more about both of those and how we can detect the known stuff versus anomalous behavior on the network. From my own perspective, a real world analogy is useful. If you think of a large retail store that has visible security staff, cameras monitoring the store or the entrance and exits of the store, merchandise tagging systems which will alert if somebody passes the detector with the tag. Oftentimes they also employ people inside their stores to stop and spot people who look like potential shoplifters. And that's really what threat hunting is about. It's about having somebody who's inwardly focused and looking for potential threats. So why should you do this? And I think if you're on the call, you're interested in doing it, this may just be helpful to if you're making the case internally. Security operations centers in the past have oftentimes focused on commodity malware defense. And that is important, but it is becoming increasingly automated and it doesn't catch everything. And that's just borne out by these two very basic statistics. These are from the most recent Mandiant 2017 M-Trends report. And they found that on average it's still taking 99 days to detect an intrusion, and that between 25% and half of breaches are being discovered by third parties. So what that means is that for the average large enterprise or even medium-sized enterprise today, there are most likely threats on the network that the defensive tools and the perimeter tools have not picked up. Now, of course, the consequences of a successful attack can be dramatic. We don't have to dwell on this for a long time. Target's probably a good example of a 46% drop in quarterly profit after the breach that they experienced. On the U.S. government side, we saw the resignation of the director of the Office of Personnel Management after the security clearance data was breached. And there's also the endless litigation, investigations, and other things that tend to fall out of a successful attack. So what we're really trying to do with threat hunting is decrease the targeted attacks that are successful and decrease the time that it takes to discover and eradicate intrusions. And, you know, just to bring it around to a pithy statement there, the best defense is a good offense. So, Dave, did you want to add anything here from your federal perspective?
Yes, the comment about the consequences being dramatic, and at the federal space that can occur in different levels. At the very minimum, a breach will bring bad publicity, and nobody wants that. In the federal government, there's that phrase, I don't want my shop to be in the Washington Post, and certainly nobody likes to have bad publicity. Breaches can also lead to specialized OIG audits or maybe greater scrutiny on the next OIG audit, which can be time-consuming and lead to additional resources that have to be allocated to deal with those OIG audits. But even worse, a breach on a federal agency can bring damage to the agency's mission or to the agency's operations. And we all know that there's so many important federal operations and tasks that are being taken care of in all different departments in all different ways. And so a breach can definitely cause some sort of disruption or harm to those agency missions, and we never want to see that.
Now, some of the leading organizations are beginning to jump into this. Ernst & Young did a report not too long ago on what they called third generation security operations centers. And what they said in the report is that detecting known bad activities remains a relevant function for SOCs, but the newer ones are evolving to identify threats themselves, particularly those for which no previous baseline has been observed. And that's very much in the strike zone of a threat hunting program. A couple of other benefits that we see is just that if you're practicing this on a regular basis within the enterprise, it is going to drive a better understanding among your security team, both of external threats and of defenses. And that in turn is going to drive environment-specific improvements to the defensive posture. And what we mean by environment-specific is just the contrast between the security team that waits for industry to push out a new tool or a new piece of threat intelligence that they can use in their security stack. Contrast that with the team that is seeing the kinds of targeted attacks that are directed at their specific enterprise and is continually adapting their security posture, reflecting that very specific threat information and specific threats that are coming at them. For the practitioner, of course, doing this is going to increase your knowledge of both your infrastructure and the security systems that exist to protect it. That, of course, is going to make you more valuable, increase your understanding of threat actors, which is also a good thing. And then this is a hot field, so maybe good from a career standpoint, something good to focus on and learn more about. Keys to building a program. These are things that we're hearing from folks out there who are doing threat hunting today, and they're really just 4 points that we wanted to make here. First and foremost is just around having an explicit commitment to the discipline of threat hunting. And that just is reflective of the tendency that if you don't actually have some formality around making this someone's job or part of someone's job, then the tendency is going to be for everybody to lapse back into managing incidents. So that explicit commitment from leadership can be really important to keeping people focused on this over time. Knowing and prioritizing your critical value data is also really important. That's also often going to require engaging people outside of security, out in business units and other stakeholders to know exactly what is critical, where it is, and to keep that information current over time because, of course, it's constantly changing. Understanding the infrastructure is also very important as we think about and try to anticipate attacks. We need to understand where are the weak points in the enterprise. And I think the corollary to that is oftentimes it's very helpful to know how those who administer that infrastructure go about that task. How do they add new user accounts? How do they change firewall rules? Those things are important to know because in threat hunting, you're going to be looking for hackers doing those things. So understanding how they should be occurring in your organization versus what might be anomalous is very useful and important. On the tool side, we sort of see 3 categories of tools that are relevant to this. First and foremost is sensing, and that is just the ability to log and collect data from various parts of the infrastructure. There's a second grouping of solutions in the data aggregation, analysis, and visualization category that are helping analysts make sense out of large volumes of data that are being collected. Oftentimes there's a high degree of normalization that has to occur in order to actually accomplish that. And then deception is another one that we see as being very important, even though it's not often talked about. This is an emerging technology that can be very helpful by enticing people basically to do things that you can more easily detect. Interestingly enough, the Ernst & Young SOC report describes trapping and coercion as one of the 2 main threat hunting activities. So deception, I think, is going to play an increasingly important role in basically creating the conditions by which threat actors do things that we can detect through threat hunting. And it can also distract the adversary from the real vulnerabilities on the network. From a data source standpoint, in general, when people are talking about threat hunting, there's 4 main categories of data they're looking at. Perimeter devices are, of course, looking at logs from anything that's routing packets between networks, firewalls, routers, VPN concentrators, switches. On the network itself, of course, we're looking at internal routers or appliances that may not be internet facing but are part of the enterprise network infrastructure. Applications, enterprise data stores, oftentimes it is customer relationship management, enterprise resource planning, ERP solutions that are being targeted, or think of the central personnel data file at OPM, which was targeted for the clearance breach. Last but not least, in fact, last and most importantly from our perspective is endpoint data. And that's, of course, data from devices that are used to store data and perform the business of the enterprise, servers, laptops, PCs, mobile devices. And we at Nuix are really focused on this endpoint category, and that's what we're going to spend time in today in the demonstration. And from our perspective, there's a unique vantage point for threat hunting that endpoints offer, and that's really for 3 main reasons. First and foremost, on endpoints, you're typically going to get more traces and indicators of an attack than you're going to see on other devices. If you look across the cyber kill chain, on the endpoint, you're going to find indicators of the initial exploit, of command and control, privilege escalation, lateral movement, and data exfiltration or executing the attack, all in one place. And just as an example, one of the more common attack techniques today is using PowerShell to do various things on the network to move around. And without endpoint data, it's going to be very difficult, if impossible, to know what exactly people are doing with PowerShell. Another advantage we see to focusing on the endpoint is that endpoints themselves are increasingly being used outside the perimeter network defenses. So those sources may be not of much value when you're hunting for evidence of an attack of a laptop that was being used in a Starbucks or in a hotel room somewhere. The endpoint data is going to give you visibility into that, even if you don't have anything in your network defense logs. And last but not least is that the next generation of endpoint logging technology is actually able to capture data from some of the other sources. And just as one example, a lot more network data is actually being captured by the leading endpoint solutions than in the past. And Dave, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on this one.
Yeah, I do want to talk a little bit about the network data. A lot of times in the past, people have sort of neglected this area because of storage space reasons, either because of the cost or just the physical room to store multiple drives. But I would strongly encourage anybody that's in the security realm to not overlook this area. Whether you get the data from an endpoint solution or whether you get it through more traditional means, through the servers themselves or some sort of aggregate, you want to pay attention to things like DHCP logs, VPN logs, DNS logs, email logs, web logs. All those kinds of things are very important to collect. This is going to help augment your threat hunting capabilities. Drive storage is so inexpensive now. There's really almost no excuse, I think, to not collect these different types of log files. And SANS, who Hoke has mentioned them before, has a great term that they use, which is forensic readiness. And what that means is you always want to hope that nothing happens. We always want to do the best we can to prevent any type of intrusion or compromise of our information. But you always want to be ready just in case something were to happen. That's where this whole concept of forensic readiness comes into play. And in addition to collecting your endpoint data, you also want to make sure that you're collecting things at more of the enterprise level, at the network level, in terms of your core servers and applications.
It's a kind of a belt and suspenders approach. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to put forward this framework for threat hunting, and this is just a way to think about how to approach the problem in a systematic way over time. And it starts with the 3 questions at the top of the page here of the slide, which is very basic. Who is targeting my enterprise? Who should I be expecting is going to come after me? What are they going to be looking for? What are they going to be trying to do? And then what tactics will they employ as they go after data, or maybe attempt to encrypt data, whatever it is that they're trying to do. These 3 questions are a great way to begin to narrow down our search across all of the different data that we're collecting. And we can develop hypothetical answers to these based on enterprise experience. In other words, what's been the history of security in my organization? What kind of attacks have we seen in the past? What are the things that we know threats are able to make money off of, or what are the things that we know they want to get access to? From personal experience, of course, this is miles under the keel that many of us have to know what are the things that we want to pay attention to and focus on. Threat reporting, of course, is so useful. There's so much good stuff out there on how threats work, on what kinds of vulnerabilities they exploit, on specifically what the code is doing if it's a malware attack, and that can be super useful in anticipating the next attack. And of course, threat feeds, which are giving us oftentimes IP addresses, DNS queries, MD5 hashes, and all sorts of things that we can look for and potentially use to narrow and focus in our search. So when we take the 3 questions and run them up against experience and threat intelligence, we might posit this example at the bottom here, which is for a financial institution. And we could assume that this new class of what some folks have called financial APTs, which are oftentimes their tactics more closely resemble state actor tactics, even though they're going after data that that will be monetized and used for monetary gain, that they're going to target enterprise application credentials, for example, in a financial institution. And so from that, I can unpack that into some expected activities that I might see at each stage of the kill chain. At the compromise level, I'm going to look for a phishing attack on my events planning department, because my events planners get a lot of external emails. They're very used to clicking on things that are from outside the enterprise, so they're good phishing targets. So I might focus on looking for phishing in that portion of my organization. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is meant to be an iterative approach. So if I don't find phishing against my events planners, I might then pivot and look for what would I be looking for if there was a waterhole attack that was used at this stage, or if there were stolen credentials that were used at this stage. So that allows me, that kind of mode of thinking allows me to explore different approaches, and then eventually, as I build out, to have a fairly comprehensive roadmap to threat hunting against different threat actors. So in this particular scenario that we might posit here, we might start with a phishing attack on events planning, moving over to the installation of command and control malware, escalating privileges by dumping out passwords, moving laterally by remotely installing and running a keylogger, and then obtaining credentials to enterprise application and exfiltrating them. So again, this is just an example and a way to begin to structure a hunt. Now, if I take that and I look at those stages and activities and then begin to think about what can I actually detect? What would I actually be hunting for across these stages and activities? I can look in 2 different categories, going back to the initial definition that we talked about. I can certainly look for known bad, and that's going to be your threat intelligence, whether it's an MD5 hash, a process name, a registry value, might be a known bad credential. If I have credentials that I know have been compromised in some way, I might look for those if they haven't been disabled. Process names, DNS queries, things like the use of Mimikatz or Nmap, process names associated with ransomware. So these are known bad, and these are certainly things that we can look for across our kill chain here. finding these is going to certainly enable us to zero in and start up an investigation on a particular compromise or intrusion, and may be able to enable us to stop something from actually turning into a major breach. On the anomalous side, in these cases, I don't really know exactly what I'm looking for. It's a bit fuzzier. So I might start, for example, in the phishing category with looking for an unrecognized process that starts up under my enterprise email, since I know generally that in a phishing attack, that's what's going to happen. Then I'm going to start to look for this kind of unrecognized process activity. If it's watering hole, I might look for an executable running out of my app data directory, which is going to require me to sort out a good bit of white noise. I might also be looking for use of PowerShell or PS exec, uses of admin shares, large file transfers. These are all things that fall into the anomalous category. And from what we are seeing in this category, in both of these categories, you can generate a bit of white noise. But in this anomalous category, the trick is really knowing how do I distinguish legitimate activity using tools like PowerShell or PS exec, which are legitimate administrative tools, from things that hackers are doing or threat actors are doing. So for the demonstration today, we're going to focus this in on just a few of these, given that we don't have a tremendous amount of time. At the initial compromise stage, we'll focus on looking for that anomalous process that's being run by a mail client. At the established foothold stage, we'll look for malware that might be querying a command and control server, and then the step of disabling firewalls. At escalate privileges, we'll look for dumping passwords out of memory. For lateral movement, of course, there's so many ways to look at this. What we're going to focus on is opening a command prompt on a remote system, and then enabling remote access or RDP access to a system. And then finally, at the execute strike stage, we'll look at transfer of a large file to file sharing site. What I hope to get across to you is that there is, if we look across the kill chain, that there's a threat hunting framework that we can look all the way across and address this in its totality. In other words, we can see activities that are occurring at every stage of this process using endpoint data. And then what I would also like to show is that we can quickly pivot from something that we discover on the threat hunting process into an investigation, into a deep dive into a particular threat or an artifact that we think may constitute a threat. And then from that, we can actually proceed into the beginnings of a remediation process. And then if I want to move upstream, or as we sometimes say, as my colleague Chris Pogue likes to say, left of breach, what can I do from an alerting standpoint to prevent this from happening again? And then what can I even put in place to not just alert, but actually completely prevent this kind of attack from happening on my network again? So that's what we're going to try to get across in the demo today. Dave, is there anything I left out that you'd like to chime in on here?
No, you didn't leave anything out, but I would just reiterate that these are four, you can almost call these the four corners of information security: the prevention, the alerting, the investigations, and the remediation. All four of these are very important, and a good endpoint security tool can definitely help with all four of those important elements. And I would just add, with the remediation, a lot of times when security people think of remediation, they're thinking specifically about fixing the problem. So that may involve containment, in other words, stopping some kind of outbreak from spreading to additional machines. Obviously, that's very important. Moving on to the actual repair work, the actual removal of the bad artifact, or restoring good content, whatever the actual repair that needs to be done for the vulnerability, and possibly adding some vulnerability scanning after you're done to verify that your remediation has taken place. And so those are obviously important steps in any kind of incident remediation. But I would also add that you want to carry that one a little bit further and go back and revisit any kind of alerting or warning capabilities that you have. You may want to strengthen those or tweak them a little bit. For example, using a good endpoint tool. And also you may need to adjust your training and awareness and possibly written policies as part of any kind of remediation plan.
That's awesome. And I think that feedback loop is exactly what we're trying to establish, is how do I connect an investigation quickly back into an improvement in my enterprise defense and my enterprise security. So this is the Nuix Insight Adaptive Security. I mentioned this is the second newest product at Nuix. And the way adaptive security works is we have agents installed on enterprise endpoints. Those agents are operating as kernel mode drivers, reporting back on things that are occurring on endpoints to our server. And this console is interacting with the database that server sits on top of. So what I have here in my view is a set of alerts. Alerts are being generated in real time or near real time by agents on endpoints. They're alerting based on behaviors that they see that are may be indicative of malware or of insider threat or of some sort of elevated risk, perhaps malicious use of legitimate software on the network. Those are all the kinds of things that our logic engine or the logic engine in adaptive security is able to alert on, and that's what you see at the top of the screen here. At the middle pane is just the endpoint connections I have. So right now I've got 2 endpoints connected up onto the laptop here, streaming data in, and at the bottom some very basic visualization of what's going on in this case on endpoint 4. So we actually explore data using insight creators, and for each of the 12 digital behaviors, the way that adaptive security works is we create insights or tabular views of each of these data types. Sessions is user logins, processes is just applications that are starting and stopping. Threads load up under processes or loaded by them. Modules are all of the dynamic link libraries that are loaded by processes. We are also capturing key logs, file system writes, renames, and deletes, registry events, network connections, removable media usage, namespace queries, print events, and then all that information can be combined on this thing called the event timeline. What we're starting with here is that look for anomalous processes. So we're going to focus on phishing, that first stage of the kill chain. We're looking for basically a phishing attack in which a user's enticed to open an attachment in an email. That could be a PDF or a Word document. Often means from a Windows standpoint that Outlook or Acrobat Reader or Microsoft Office starts up a sub process or a child process. So I've got here a list of around 3,200 process events for a single period here in adaptive security, and each time a process starts or stops or exits, it's captured here. For each process, I've got a parent name, I've got the process name itself and a process identifier, I've got an MD5 hash and the full path of the process. So the question is, how do I get down into what was anomalous running under Outlook? And actually, we have a pretty good way to do that using process grouping. So I'm going to group processes, first of all, by parent, not by parent PID, but by parent name. And then I'm going to group by process name. And that's going to allow me to show, first of all, what were the unique parent processes that were running. And I can see here's Outlook. And I can see that in this data set, I had 3 unique child processes run under Outlook: Adobe Acrobat Reader, Microsoft Word, and WinZip. None of that looks particularly suspicious. So I might then look for other processes that have had child processes running under them. And I'm going to focus here just for demonstration purposes on Word, and I can see that Word has just started up another instance of itself, and also on WinZip. Now on WinZip, I see that there were 3 unique processes running under WinZip. Acrobat Reader, Word again, and a wiping utility that Adobe uses. I also see this process here. This is something called Afghan Air Force.scr. And I might at this point say, okay, I don't recognize that on my network, and I want to take a closer look at it. So from a threat hunting standpoint, what I've just done is I have identified something anomalous that is running under an Office process, or a process that's going to be employed by somebody reading email. So in this case, it's WinZip. So this is a good, my hypothesis at this point might be that there is a phishing attack that's gone on, and that I had Afghan Air Force kicked off by WinZip, which was running under Outlook. So if I wanted to pivot from this point from a threat hunt into an investigation, then I can dissect this using these insights. And I could start by just doing a search now that I know that I'm looking for Afghan Air Force, searching for cases in which it's either a process or a parent. And this is a filter editor tool that allows me to do that fairly easily. And I've applied these filters, by the way, in advance, everybody, just because it would be so tedious to watch me inputting the date, time values and these filter settings. So please pardon me for that, but if you'll bear with me, I think you'll appreciate that we can cover a bit more ground having done it that way. So in this case, I have Afghan Air Force. I again was looking for it as a parent process, and I see that it started up another child process called usha.exe. And I've got the command line that was used to start that process. I've also got a full path to that process. If I continue to dig into that, I might look to see, where did USHA actually run? Did it start up any child processes of its own? And see that it actually did. It started up a process that looks like an innocuous Windows process, the service host process. Now it happens to be running in this case out of a file path that it doesn't normally run out of a syswal64 file path. If I wanted to look, I could also analyze the MD5 hash of the binary to confirm that it's actually a corrupted version of the service host process. So I have all that information here at my disposal as part of this investigation into the threat that I've discovered. I might take another look at what else this process is doing by looking, for example, at namespace queries it's making. So since oftentimes, particularly if we are looking for something that might be making a call out to another server to download additional code or to find instructions, this would be a good way to begin to assess the presence or absence of that going on. So in this case, my search was for the process identifier associated with service host. And what it's showing me is that I have a number of queries to a site called www.dicemention.com, and that is a known bad domain, known to be used as part of a remote access Trojan campaign that took place a couple of years ago. If I wanted to continue my investigation, I could also look at DLL files that are loaded up by this process and network connections it's made. In this case, I've done a sort here to show me the unique network connections, and I've found that there's actually 2 of them, 2 IP addresses that I might take a closer look at. This is just an internal broadcast here, but this one would be worth investigating as potentially threat intelligence, and as the host that is actually playing the role of command and control for this particular threat. So that is one way to dive into phishing and to look for phishing, and to pivot into a deeper investigation of a threat. Now, if I wanted to actually stretch up into going back to that first slide, if I wanted to look at prevention, how to actually prevent something like this, we do that with a logic engine. The logic engine runs on each agent and gives us the ability to block and alert and prevent against threats that we've discovered. So in this case, I can quickly go in and find my alert engine category for known malicious code. And in this case, I might say, now that I know that this process has this particular MD5 hash, I'm going to block that and prevent it from ever running on my enterprise. I might also say that since I saw this running out of a process path that it obviously created, this is definitely something malicious, that block anytime you see this process path or you see a binary attempt to run from this particular process path. And then the last alerting or blocking that I could do is I could say, if it is service host and it is running out of syswal64, either block or alert. Now, at this point, I might not have enough information to know for certain that service host is never going to run legitimately out of syswal64. So I'm going to put this in alert mode and watch it for a while to see if it causes any problems before setting it as an actual block rule. Okay, so hopefully then that's provides a good example of how we might pivot from threat hunting into investigation and then back up into prevention and remediation. The next example here is around establishing foothold. And basically what I'm looking for here is any case in which I have a piece of malware that is making a call out to an external network. And so this is a good way to apply threat intelligence. So if I have known bad domains that I want to look for, I could just input them here. In this case, I have a very simple small query. You could certainly put in many more than this if you desired. This is a demonstration of looking for dicemention.com, and we can quickly see that that query has been made from this one particular machine. Now, in this case, this was a search across 7 days of data across all endpoints in the enterprise. So this would quickly give me an indicator if this particular threat was present on any host other than the one that I had already discovered it on. But as I can see here, it is only on this particular G4L17. Another tactic that we might see is the use of a networking utility, Windows command utility, to turn off turn off the firewall. So we can hunt for that by just looking for any time that we have that process running, this net process, and the command line contains this particular command right here, which indicates that the firewall has been turned off. And that simple search right there, again, looking across a week or so of data, is going to show me that I did have a host where that application ran with that command language. And a sort of closer look here, I can see that, first of all, it was run on G4L510 on my Windows 10 host here, where the firewall was turned off. Then the same utility was used to turn the firewall off on server 2 and on another host here on G4L710. So this gives me an initial picture or something to look for in terms of establishing foothold and what people might be doing to disable or compromise firewalls. Now I can also look in the registry for things like disabling Windows Defender. I was recently experimenting with trying to disable Defender on Windows 10, and ultimately the GUI is actually more challenging than just running the command in PowerShell. So we can find that by looking for the registry value name, disable real-time monitoring, in the registry event data that we're collecting. So this is a search that's going to immediately show me that the registry has been, or I'm sorry, Windows Defender rather, was disabled on G4L610. And I might want to take a closer look at exactly how that was accomplished by exploring process data around this event and around this timestamp to learn, well, how actually did they disable Windows Defender. The next stage we'll look at here is privilege escalation. So oftentimes, of course, first account, an attacker is compromising, doesn't have the privilege level he wants to move around on the network. So one way of getting access to accounts with elevated privileges is running a program called Mimikatz. Running Mimikatz will dump out passwords and authentication information, not just for the authenticated user, but for all authentication sessions since the last reboot. And this is what that would look like as Mimikatz ran on G4L 1.7. Now, in this case, Mimikatz was actually embedded into something that's designed to look like the Windows Defender process, and I have my colleague Ivan Iverson on the Nuix incident response team to thank for providing me with this binary here, which is actually being used to dump out passwords, again disguised as Defender here. And my search is, I could certainly search just for the commands that I know are used to run Mimikatz. In this case, I'm actually looking for the process name, and I want to see any case in which the command line for that process name contains passwords, which is going to tip me off that it's being used for this particular purpose. So the next thing we'll look at is lateral movement, and there's so many techniques for this. There's a lot of different things we could look for. One thing that to focus on that we see as an important and unfrequently used tool is PSExec. So in this case, what I'm actually looking for is just the use of PSExec. And what I can see, because we're capturing the command line that's entered when PSExec starts up, is how it's being used. So in this case, what I see is that, again, on my one particular G4L 510 host, I've got PSExec running, and PSExec is being used to open a command prompt on G4L 710 on this other Windows 10 box. And I've got some username and password information that's being passed in to enable the user to get access to this particular host. So this is a way of, again, looking for lateral movement using PSExec. Back to the registry again, the registry will provide sort of a smoking gun if somebody is going in to enable remote dial-up connections. So maybe a credential is compromised on the server, but the threat actor hasn't yet had a chance wants to remote into the machine, but hasn't been able to do that or needs to find a way to do that. So he's going to first remotely enable that by changing a setting in the registry to enable remote dial-up connections. Now, he could do that using regedit, using a remote connection over regedit. And if that happens, then the process name that actually performs that task is the service host. And that's what you're seeing here. When we see this value name of fdeny_ts connections changing, we know that the machine's ability to accept or deny remote dial-up connections has been changed. So in the case of service host, that's pointing at using regedit remotely. And in the case of system properties remote.exe, this is using the server administrator tool on the local box to make that change. Now that comes back to the earlier point about knowing how administrators in your enterprise actually do things. If your administrators generally tend to use the server manager tool to make changes to remote dial-up, then this would be innocuous, and this would be something to focus on. Okay, and then the last stage of our kill chain look here is around data exfiltration. So what we're looking for in this case is a really simple search for a large data transfer to either Dropbox or Pastebin. Now I could look for connections over the FTP protocol or from unexpected locations. I could look for a number of different things at this stage. We've just put this one in here to illustrate this use of network data. And what we're searching for is any case in which I've got bytes sent greater than 30 megs, and I've got a remote address that corresponds to Dropbox or Pastebin. And that query, of course, I'm looking across many different network events, in this case about 17,000, and this is going to show me that on this G4L 610 host at 11:30 or about 11:30 on the 28th, I had this large file transfer out to the Dropbox IP. I could look that up from within the UI here if I needed to. That is pretty much the waterfront for threat hunting in an adaptive security tool. There's many other things we could look at around stolen credentials, for example, or remotely logging into a host from outside the network versus inside the network. But I think this is probably good enough to paint a picture of one way that you could approach threat hunting from within an endpoint tool. And basically, just to give you a quick recap of what we did, we started by looking for a phishing attack, and we did that by searching for anomalous processes that Outlook started up. We discovered a suspicious process and then quickly pivoted into an investigation of that process behavior, including the network connections that it made. We then configured alerting and blocking to prevent that threat from ever executing on the network again. And from there, we went through the 4 remaining stages of the kill chain on the threat hunting to follow the threat hunting process. And that went from establishing a beachhead to escalating privileges to moving laterally and finally exfiltrating data. So with that, hopefully that was informative. I'm going to pass the ball back to Dave to wrap things up, and thank you again.
Thank you, Hoke. I would like to conclude by saying that cyber threat hunting is a very important tactical capability that security professionals should add to their security game plan. In the federal arena, for those of you who work in the federal space, you're probably well aware that FISMA and the NIST 853 authority to operate process, the ATO process, all place a very strong emphasis on security at the system level, as well as protection of certain types of data, such as privacy-related data, financial systems, financial data, etc. But FISMA and the risk management framework, or the authority to operate process, they're highly focused on what I would call fundamental defensive measures and fundamental defensive categories, such as contingency planning and access control. And these are all very important. These are all very necessary steps. But in this webinar, we have shown you how you can take your security operations to a much more dynamic level, a much more proactive level, getting a lot more detailed into what's going on in your environment and on your network. And cyber threat hunting is something that you can look at as the next level after you conquered the basic security framework that's set out by FISMA and NIST. You can go even deeper with a cyber threat hunting capability. I also want to mention that we have our next webinar will be on, I believe it's September 12th, and it's going to be led by Paul Slater, who is our Global Head of Investigations. And the topic of the next webinar will be hyperscaling your investigations and intelligence capabilities. And in this webinar, Nuix is going to show you how you can easily ingest very, very large quantities of investigative and forensic data from all variety of sources, both structured and unstructured data, and also how you can connect multiple investigations together. So I hope that you're able to join us for that webinar. It's going to be very, very informative. Also, I want to call out our user exchange that's going to be in the week of September 17 through 20 in Huntington Beach, California. If you're able to make this exciting conference, we strongly encourage you to do so. We have a variety of workshops and panel sessions that are going to be going on. It's a very affordable price. You can get more information about all of our upcoming webinars as well as the user exchange by going to nuix.com. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. Hopefully it was informative for you, and have a great, wonderful day. Thank you.